Welcome to another episode of The Intelligent Speculator, where our purpose is to provide insights into economic and market movements that have been successful in helping us grow our wealth. And now, let's hear from the hosts of our show, Jesse Sanders and Lathan Fritz.
Hey guys, I'm your co-host Jesse Sanders. We've broken up today's interview into two parts. And on this first segment, Lathan and I discuss some of the unprecedented stimulus measures that are in effect. The helicopter money, the PPP loans, but really trying to step back and say, what is going to be the long-term effect on the U.S. dollar? Are we going to have massive inflation? Will there need to be some sort of massive debt forgiveness? So let's jump right in as we're discussing that on today's call. Hey Lathan, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Jess. How you doing?
All is well here, man. So we're jumping into our fifth podcast now, and one of the things, as I was reading back on one of the articles you shared in the Facebook group on the SDRs, we'll get into that in a bit more, in just a little bit. We talk a lot, or you've talked a lot, on the printing of money that's happening just at crazy rates right now, and some of the kind of potential outcomes of where this is going to lead. We've done the helicopter money, there's been the PPP loans, and it seems like the two outcomes from this could either one be massive debt forgiveness sometime down the road, or an accelerated printing of money and just kind of keep printing our way out of this thing until the point of massive inflation. Would you agree with that assessment? Add or take away anything from that?
Yeah, I mean, you make all kind of like really, good points that I would, in many ways, agree to, and I think there's going to be certain nuances to all of those things. I would say, well, one, with kind of like just the unprecedented amount of fiscal stimulus that has been coming out from the federal government, and then also the monetary stimulus, or basically what we can say printing of money from the Federal Reserve, is just, it's reached insane amounts at this point. And all I can say is I see it as, not immediately are we going to see hyperinflation, let alone inflation. I think right now we're going to actually have the opposite effect, a huge deflationary problem. And that's because of all this debt that we have. Even with all this money printing that's going on, there's huge lack for a demand of services and products. So if people aren't spending the money that's being printed, you don't have inflation, because inflation is both the printing of money, or the major significant creation of money, combined with the velocity of money. So people actually have to spend it. They have to go out to restaurants, entertainment, ball games, things like that, and basically having more money chasing the same amount of goods and services. Instead, we have a problem of there is almost, demand has been cut in many ways by 20 to 30% in some industries. So
even that people are getting the money from, these get the check in the mail or get it wired into their account, if they're not going out and eating at the restaurant, staying in a hotel, taking a cruise, it's not doing anything for the economy, because that money's just sitting in their checking account.
Exactly. Or it's basically because again, a lot of individuals have debt. Most individuals have debt.
Yeah.
So instead of going and spending on new consumer stuff, the money that they're getting from the government, they're holding on, because a lot of them have been laid off. A lot of them are, have decreased incomes. So they're not thinking like, oh, this money I'm getting from the government and all these loans, I'm not going out and spending it. I'm holding on to it and then using it to pay off mandatory expenses. So rent, mortgages, or credit card debt that they have, or auto debt that they have, because that stuff doesn't necessarily stop, right? And so it's not that money isn't being spent on goods and services. It's actually being spent, for the most part, on paying down debt that these individuals already have. And so that creates deflation in many ways, kind of what we talk about when, a Federal Reserve raises interest rates. It makes debt more expensive, so people don't want to have as much debt. There's not as much loans that occur. And so there's less spending that occurs. And I think for the next, year to 3 years, we're actually going to see a deflationary problem. However, like with all markets, eventually things kind of settle down. There's going to have to be some kind of realization that we have too much debt, and there's no way that individuals, cities, states, and even federal governments are going to be paying it off. And so we're going to have a real conversation, say, well, we'll probably try to print a lot of it off. We will also forgive that which we don't want to print off. And then at that point, when things kind of settle down and money and people start feeling better, a little bit better about things, and then they start spending all of that money that has been created, that's when you're going to see the velocity of money. And that's
you think that velocity of money, you don't see that happening sometime in the short term. You think that's still a year, maybe 3 years out.
Yeah, I would say we're probably looking at, at least probably closer to 3 or 4 years before we start seeing kind of like an increase in velocity of money from all the money that's been printed. And
if the deflationary measures you foresee happening, if that goes that direction, do you anticipate the Fed continuing to increase and continuing to print more and more money to kind of combat that?
Yeah, because I think right now, politically, I don't think they have, and I think even a couple of years from now, there won't be the political courage or will to necessarily raise interest rates significantly. In fact, if anything, they'll try to keep rates ultra low or even go into negative interest rates. So basically trying to force people to spend money and not keep it in a bank account and then move it into.
And by courage or kind of political will, what are you saying? Because if even if they think the right thing would be to raise interest rates, they wouldn't want to do it because there'd be a national outcry of, oh my gosh, I can't get money, life is hard. Just kind of the pain from that.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like, because we're, more likely than not, we're going to be in a very severe economic contraction for the next couple of years. And so can you imagine where it's like people are already struggling, it's already tough. And just when things are starting to be like, oh, maybe we're turning a corner and things are getting better, then the Federal Reserve steps in and says, well, we printed all this money and we can't have all these people chasing these goods and services with it. So we're going to start raising interest rates and start kind of pulling back. What are people going to say? No, what are you doing? And so you're gonna come to a conclusion where there's not going to be the political will to be like, oh, we don't want to crush an economy that's already been crushed and crush it even more.
For sure.
And so they're gonna be like, okay, interest rates will continue to we'll keep them low or keep them negative. And at that point, again, lending will start increasing, people will start spending, and they'll have all this, free money and debt forgiveness that will probably have occurred, over the next several years. And then at that point, once inflation's out of the bag, it's very hard to control. So we'll start seeing inflation, and then the Federal Reserve will be like, oh, let's lay off a little bit more. And then pretty soon, when it starts creeping up into high single digits and double digits, then they'll be like, okay, now we have to raise interest rates, but they're already behind the curve at that point. And that's when it's very much like, we've seen this movie before, and you can kind of see, in the 70s, where it kind of started with Richard Nixon taking us off the gold standard in 1971. Mm-hmm. And because up until from 1945, there was a thing called the Bretton Woods agreement that occurred. And basically it made the United States dollar the reserve currency of the world, but it was backed by gold. And then because of deficits that the United States had run because of the Vietnam War and different massive entitlement programs of the 60s that they increased, all these countries were kind of getting nervous about the deficits that the federal government was running. And so they started trading in their dollars for gold. Well, the reserves at Fort Knox were starting to go empty, and we weren't going to have enough to redeem all these dollars that the world wanted traded in. So Richard Nixon just said, no, you can't take any more gold. We're going to make it a free-floating fiat currency with no backing. And so that 1971 kind of Nixon shock, as it was called, really kind of created, not immediately, but slowly inflation started increasing. And the Federal Reserve kept interest rates, very low for most of the 70s until all of a sudden in the late 70s, you're getting double-digit inflation. And there's an economic contraction going on at the same time. So you have both economic pain because there's high unemployment. You have your dollar that every month is literally, worth less and less. And at the time, there wasn't really anybody that was willing to have the courage to fix it until ironically Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker, and he started saying, the only way to save our monetary system and the reserve status of the dollar is we got to put faith and trust back into it. So we need to raise interest rates. And then that was at this, like literally, I think it was like a few months later, Ronald Reagan got elected, and he agreed with Paul Volcker, and he said, you know what, keep raising interest rates and get this tiger back in the bag of inflation. And as a result of him significantly raising interest rates, I think at one point it was 19 or 20%. That the Fed, So imagine a home mortgage, getting a house. In an economic condition like today, could you imagine if mortgage rates were 20-25% for a house? That'd be nuts.
I refinanced my house. I wasn't happy with my rate was just over 5. Refinanced to get a better rate.
Yeah, exactly.
20 would be a different story.
Yeah, and you can talk to people in their late 50s, 60s, and 70s who were buying houses during that time period, and they'll tell you they remember when they got their home. There wasn't a lot of home buying occurring at the time, obviously, because you had super high interest rates. Kind of what we've talked about. When you have higher interest rates, there's a less demand for debt. And fortunately, with Paul Volcker and kind of Ronald Reagan's backing, he drastically raised interest rates, and everybody hated him for about 2 years. The economy went into a deep recession. The Democrats had a massive sweep in the midterm elections in 1982 as a result of it. But then all of a sudden, kind of like in 1983, there was a corner turned, and inflation started getting under control, and economic growth started continuing again. And by 1984, for Ronald Reagan's reelection, he was voted in one of the I think the biggest landslide victory of electoral college history, for the very reason that the economy was doing very, very well, inflation was low again, and the economy was strong and healthy. And you could argue that Paul Volcker kind of led 20 years of financial stability and growth in the United States, even in the 90s, where for the first time we were running, since the 1950s, in 1990 we were running budget surpluses in our federal government because our economy was so strong, and our dollar was again kind of had the faith in the world, the world's faith in it again, and so
you mentioned the faith, the world's faith in the dollar. That's where you see that waning with us, kind of this excessive printing of money, and if there's some kind of national debt forgiveness, that's what you think Paul Volcker understood and was willing to kind of go through the hard years to raise the interest rates so that there was that good faith in the U.S. dollar?
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, it's all money is just paper, right? Yeah. There's no value in it except somebody's trust. Like that's the only value it has. It's the trust that government, whoever's, the dollar's backed by the U.S. government. So it's only people's trust in a government for creating, making financially sound decisions, that someone will continue to trust that medium of exchange. And as soon as you lack trust, then that's when people leave it. Mm-hmm. And that's when people desert it and drop it, when people start getting nervous. Kind of like Bitcoin, at first, you had this huge fluctuation where, nobody knew what it was. And then pretty soon everybody was talking about, and everybody had this, you could say, short-term trust in it. But then pretty soon there's all these problems where it was like, well, it's just a digital thing and a unit of account, and it's actually very difficult to buy anything with it. And the whole point of Bitcoin was it's supposed to be a medium of exchange, and it had these huge fluctuation values. And then pretty soon it was, it went from $20,000 till, it fell down to, what was like $3,500 a Bitcoin in a span of about a year and a half. And not to say that it won't go back up again, but you can see how it's literally the valuation of that unit, of that asset class, had all to do with trust and whether people trust it or not. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you lose trust in something, that's when people start leaving it, and its value decreases significantly. Which is why I think, with the Federal Reserve, what they're doing now, with the federal government, what they're doing now, and what I believe they will do here in the next few years, it will have the opposite effect of what Paul Volcker did in the 80s, and the world will start looking at alternatives to the U.S. dollar as their reserve currency.
Well, guys, that's all the time we have for today. I do hope you'll join us for part 2 of this call as we finish this discussion around some of the results that these stimulus measures will have on our economy and the U.S. dollar as a whole. And then 2, as we look a bit further, what would happen if the world does lose faith? If there is a massive debt forgiveness, what does that mean for the U.S. dollar? So appreciate you joining us, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you for listening to this interview with Lathan Fritz and Jesse Sanders. We hope to see you next time, and remember to like and follow The Intelligent Speculator on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are posting insightful nuggets of economic and market movements. And if you would like to get exclusive information, feel free to join the Intelligent Speculator Facebook group. Good day.